Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are very glad to see you here for this Signum Symposium on A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. So this is a series offered by Signum University, and we're bringing in some noteworthy scholars to talk about these books and the TV show. Now, I just want to give you some announcements first, tell you about a couple of upcoming events, and then I will introduce our guests and we'll get into the material. First of all, if you are here and watching this symposium, well then maybe you can consider giving a donation to be able to allow this series to continue. So you can go to signumuniversity.org/donate in order to enable us to continue offering this and other free programs. There are some other upcoming events that you might want to consider attending. There's Exploring the Lord of the Rings, which is a free weekly seminar in which Corey Olsen explores The Lord of the Rings on Tuesday evenings at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we have a new Mythgard Academy class, The Treason of Isengard. This is the 7th volume in the History of Middle-earth series, and that's Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So you have lots of Tolkien opportunities for material here at Signum. There's also the Lord of the Rings stream on Fridays, and we have our fall courses starting up in the Language and Literature department at Signum University, so you probably want to check out the list of future courses on the website. We always welcome new students. You can take for credit or you can audit at various levels. So if you like what you're getting here for free and you want to up your engagement and become an actual student at Signum University, please consider doing that. Okay, I want to encourage everyone who is attending today to ask questions throughout. And the way you can do that is there's a questions box, should be on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can type in questions to us, and I'll read out to our participants as many of those as we have time for and as they fit the conversation and so forth. So please feel free to do that. Now, I'm about to introduce our guests, but while I do that, I would like to ask all of you attendees to do something. Find that questions box, and if you would please type in to me how many of the books in George R.R. Martin's series have you read, and how many seasons of the HBO TV series have you seen? I'm just curious to know who's in our audience, how much material you've all read or watched. And I am going to make just the big, huge general spoiler warning right now. We are going to talk about everything that has been released up until the moment. So if you hate that, you can go away and then come back and watch the recording of this symposium after you've caught up. But we're kind of operating on the principle that something can't be spoiled unless it wasn't really worth spoiling in the first place. In other words, if the work is of any value as literature or as cinema, then it will stand up to your simply knowing what happens, because the interest will still be in watching how it unfolds, the words that the author uses, the film techniques and the acting of everyone in the TV show. So that's sort of the premise on which we're operating and why we feel comfortable giving spoilers. I myself am not caught up, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit too, so I feel your pain. Okay, so please go ahead and tell me that while I introduce our panel today. So I am Serena Higgins. I'm the chair of the Language and Literature department here at Signum University. And with us we have Chris Swank, who is also on the faculty of Signum. She's one of our graduates and also on the faculty, and a librarian by trade. And she has also published on Harry Potter and has done a thesis on Tolkien and other subjects. We have Dr. Susan Johnston, who is an associate professor of English at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, where she teaches and supervises work in fantasy literature, including Martin, also Victorian literature and literary historiography. Now, particularly for our panel today, she's published on adaptation, popular culture, and fantasy literature, including a few works on Martin that we'll probably be referencing today. I'm going to send you all the links to her books in the chat so that you can go over to Amazon or Questia and check out her books and articles. And we have Dr. Brian Pavlak, who is professor of history at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. His special research interests are medieval Germany, Holy Roman Empire, and the witch hunt. Is also a priest in Bethlehem at St. Stephen's Episcopal Pro-Cathedral in Wilkes-Barre, and he also has edited a book on Game of Thrones, and I'll send you the link to that as well. We were expecting one more panelist, so if Dr. Joseph Young is able to make it into the webinar, then we'll welcome him and introduce him at that time. So welcome, everybody. Very glad to have you here. Let me give a quick overview of what our guests have said, how much they have read and how much they have seen. 0 and 0, okay. Read 2 books, watched 6 scenes, read and watched all of both multiple times, all of them up to date, all 5 books, plus the supplementary novellas and books and all the seasons of the show. We have one person who has not read any but has watched them all so far. Someone else who's read all the books plus the World Book and the Dunk and Egg, etc. All of them, not including all of the comic adaptations. All right, someone else up to date. Someone else, I've read 4.5 books and watched 5 seasons, not worried about spoilers. 5 of the books, 3 Dunk and Egg stories. Someone else who has watched the show, all except the most recent episode, but has not read the books yet. Someone else has got all the way through both the books and the show, but the show is missing out on some of the great stories. All right, so we have total range here from nothing to everything, and a little bit weighted towards more who have watched the show but haven't read all of the books. So that's fascinating to know. Thank you, everybody, for letting us know that. So I'm going to start us out, panelists, with one really big question, which is really kind of like, why are we doing this today? Which is, why study these works in an academic context, right? Here we are, people with master's degrees and PhDs who teach at the undergraduate and graduate level, and we publish peer-reviewed works. But isn't this just pop fiction? Isn't this just kind of pulp TV? So why study it in an academic context? I think I'll just go kind of around my screen, starting with Brian.
Well, what's wrong with studying popular fiction and popular culture? I went to Bowling Green State University, which was one of the hotbeds of popular culture and a major center there. A lot of popular culture becomes mainstream culture over time. Now we're gambling a little bit with it. Some stuff that was popular when I was a kid has been forgotten. Other stuff is still around, and I think it's going to go with the generations too. So if a lot of people are paying attention to it, I think it's worth investigating, particularly connecting to larger, more meaningful themes of our lives.
Excellent, well said. Susan, why study this academically?
Well, there's at least 2 reasons, but let me start with picking up with what Brian said. It's this doesn't this matter to our lives? You know, Terry Pratchett says in The Hogfather that humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. And if we think about like human expression and imagination as about that investigation of what it is to be human, then surely pop fiction, pop culture is not only part of that investigation, but central to it, whether it is in the part of the cycle where it is still super pop, or the part of the cycle where it has become, like Dickens, mainstream. And the other reason, of course, is because if you like George R.R. Martin, you're going to love Dickens. And as a Victorianist, I feel compelled to make that argument.
So it's a gateway drug. It's a little bit like the way people come in through Tolkien and they get dragged into the medieval literature.
Well, still staying in Tolkien, right? Like I think maybe some art is great. Some art is only okay. Some art lasts, and we don't always know what that's going to be. I mean, I flatter myself that I can pick them, but who am I? I've been wrong about all kinds of things, not Game of Thrones, but other things. But what I do know is that the works that we care about tell us something about the place we are and the place we want to be and the place that we have been, and surely that is, whatever else is going on, the central task of the Academy.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Okay, let me hear from Chris on that question, and then I will introduce Joseph and bring you in on that question. So Chris, what do you think? Why should we take a particular sort of high academy approach to something that's being read on a popular level?
I believe that all civilizations have some things in common. All civilizations have art. They all have a way to educate their young. They all have a sport. And all civilizations have stories. And so from the very beginning, stories were a popular popular culture or popular pastime. And I think that we should study the popular ones even more than we study the ones that only appeal to academics. And I like what Susan said, so I'm just going to say ditto to.
Thank you. All right, Joseph, how's your sound?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Very good. And see you. So let me introduce you, and then we'll get your take on why we study Game of Thrones. So Dr. Joseph Young is from the University of Otago in New Zealand, where he wrote his thesis on pre-Tolkienian secondary world fantasy. He's published since on many fantasy authors, including Martin, and currently teaches at the University of Tübingen, teaching the intellectual history of the Gothic tradition, and also writing a book about George R.R. Martin and the modern fantasy novel. So, Joseph, why study Game of Thrones?
Well, I'm studying it because I study the use of the fantastic in post-Enlightenment literature, and this is a striking example of it. I've just spent 3 days trying to figure out exactly what Lightbringer means from a structuralist standpoint. But broadly speaking, I think in the fullness of time, this story, at least in its televisual format, is going to be remembered as emblematic of this decade. In 20 years' time, when SNL are doing skits set in the 2010s, they're going to indicate that it's set then by having people rabbiting on about Game of Thrones, and just as we indicate that a story is set in the 1960s by having absolutely everybody in the world having exactly the same experiences as the roughly 4,000 kids who participated in the Summer of Love in one neighborhood in San Francisco over the course of the 3 weeks of spring break 1967. We need to avoid that kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, by getting a very good handle on something as it's happening, and that involves studying the fan culture, obviously, as an example of cultural history, but it also involves, I think, studying the text itself, because, as I say, I think the mark of a valid subject of analysis is that it stands up to analysis, and I think Game of Thrones does that very well.
Very well said. Thank you. We have a couple comments came in on that. Ruth Barrett says, I know people who have watched the show and then have read the books to see the difference and have gotten drawn into other books, including Tolkien, and have gotten hooked to fantasy. And Tony is bouncing off of what you said, Joseph, saying much like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter were emblematic of the 2000s. So you can do that same sort of cultural reference in movies and so forth. So you have all made very persuasive arguments for why we should study these things, human arguments, scholarly arguments, historical and contemporary ones. But what about all the bad stuff? I mean, there's just so much nasty content in these books and in these movies, right? There's so much violence, particularly but not exclusively violence against women. There's so much explicit sexual content. So I'm going to get personal here for just a minute so that you can kind of have somebody to talk to try to persuade. So I have tried over and over and over to get into these because I should love them, because I love all other fantasy literature. I adore dragons. I love sort of quasi-historical fiction and big world building and so forth. But I've only read a book and a half and watched the first season and a couple more episodes, because every time I read or watch, a little bit more of my soul dies. I'm like, I only have so much soul, and I can't keep sacrificing it. So what do we do with the content? So I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on specifically misogyny, violence. Is Martin promoting these things? Is he condemning them? Is he just showing them for commercial reasons? So Susan, maybe you can start us this time.
Pick me on misogyny. I actually get this question as a woman who, a feminist Canadian Catholic scholar. I get some version of this question, but aren't you a respectable Catholic matron? And what about all the sex and violence? And aren't these books really terrible? And at some level, I think my answer has to be, isn't human life kind of terrible? One of the things I loved, to take it back to Tolkien, whom I know you love, Serena, is one of the things I love about Tolkien, and what never ages for me about his books, is that they're incarnational. They are about incarnation and what that means, and an awful lot of the time it means suffering. And an awful lot of the time what suffering looks like in George R.R. Martin's medievalist fantasy world and in the HBO series Pornogrified as it sometimes is, and in the newspaper on Monday morning is like this. If you think there are happy endings, you haven't been paying attention. Little girls get hurt everywhere in the world, says Cersei Lannister, and we know that this is true, right? What I'm interested in is a literature that takes suffering seriously, just like I'm interested in, for example, a theology that takes suffering seriously, and a notion of art and a philosophy and a political philosophy that takes suffering seriously. I don't think that suffering is all there is in the world, to quote the great Michael D. Bristol, my dissertation supervisor. But Susan, a lot of good things can happen in between. But I think what the Martin books do, and the pornographication and the violence is part of this, is ask us, why do we suffer and what do we do in the face of that suffering, right? There's a really striking moment on Sunday night's episode, spoilers are coming, between Missandei and Grey Worm, which was deeply loving and deeply intimate, and it was so striking because it's counterposed to all the cold and object-like treatment of other human beings, sexually and otherwise, that marks the whole rest of the series. But in this storyverse, we are never given to understand that treating people like objects is anything but wrong.
Right. Right.
And from my perspective, one of the fundamental interests of the books is in the dignity of the human person. How do we confront and manifest that dignity and the sacrifice that it often entails in the face of suffering? And that looks like violence, and it looks like rape, and it also, hopefully more of the time, looks like the intimacy between Grey Worm and Missandei. It looks like that glorious moment when Arya Stark turns back from psychopathy, right, to share a rabbit with the soldiers of her deepest enemy.
So Tony Mead says, I'm pretty sure that people in real life have sex, do violence, and discriminate against each other for all kinds of reasons. And so you're saying we need literature as well as a theology that acknowledges that and deals with it in really deep and serious ways. Joseph, would you like to come in on this question?
Well, I think Susan made some good points here. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about certainly about both the books and the TV series, and I've read all the books and I've watched most of the series. I think, you know, we're academics here. We can probably just about dispense with the whole spoiler alert thing. I think the books are 6 years old, and anyone who's here today is probably caught up on the series. But the first narratively significant act of this series is a judicial killing. It's an execution, the execution of the deserter from the Night's Watch, whose identity varies from book to TV series. And this is not action movie violence. We are not given to believe that Ned Stark is necessarily justified in this. He is, you know, that scene actually plays out as something of a caricature of the extremely dense moral quandary that capital punishment necessarily requires us to grapple with. And you know, throughout the series, violence, as Susan says, is never depicted in any way that allows us to think that casual violence is a good thing. There's a casually violent character like Joffrey, for example, giving someone the choice, giving the singer the choice of losing his fingers or his tongue, and that's used to rob him of any moral authority he might have, any vestige of moral authority he might have. I actually have here, and this is the first book, Sir Vardis Egan, given the job of fighting Tyrion Lannister in Trial by Combat, says, My lady, pray give this burden to another. I have no taste for it. This man is no warrior. Look at him, a dwarf, half my size and lame in the legs. It would be shameful to slaughter such a man and call it justice. Now, that's, and then of course he's quite happy to go on and fight Bronn, because Bronn is able-bodied. He's attempting to demonstrate his honor and moral authority. He neglects to point out that that in doing so, he's endorsing trial by combat, which is juristically nonsensical. It makes no sense whatsoever. You know, violence is used mostly to rob people of their moral authority. It's never depicted positively. In the TV series, in the books, for example, you know, even someone like Meryn Trant is still alive, and he hasn't been killed yet. Arya hasn't killed him. So any notion that revenge is a good idea, you know, is certainly complicated, if not dismissed. I don't think these books or this TV series is gratuitously violent. Violent certainly, but not gratuitously so. As regards misogyny, there are plenty of canonically strong, positive female characters here. Catelyn Stark's a very good example. She achieves her I'm getting some looks from around the table here. She achieves her strength. It must be said, by buying into traditional female roles. She is a wife and mother. She is a diplomat, but she is working for her son. But you know, that's tricky. Women who genuinely try and break out of gender roles, like Lysa or Cersei, don't end well as a result. They come morally unstuck as a result. Having said that, I don't think the misogyny that's clearly here is meant to be depicted positively. I mean, if we take another speculative piece of fiction, which has recently been given a TV series, I notice, The Handmaid's Tale. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale depicts horrifying misogyny. The point of the story is to depict misogyny. It doesn't endorse misogyny in any way, and I think Martin could be put in the same category there.
Yeah, Ashley, you're right. I was thinking too, Brienne as being a woman who breaks out of traditional gender roles. Let me kind of up the stakes here a little bit on the question, and we'll hear from Chris and Brian on it, and then if anyone wants to respond to each other after that, that'd be great. Okay, so yeah, Joseph and Susan, maybe we've established that though the books in the show don't endorse these, you know, they do depict them, but they don't endorse them. But what about the fact that the audience that's watching them may be taking them up in a wrong way? So I'll use another piece of work as an example, C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. So we're given to believe that there's this beautiful naked woman in an unfallen world, and Ransom never has any inappropriate thoughts or feelings towards her because it's an unfallen world. Problem, Ransom himself is a fallen person. So it seems to me that he would have inappropriate responses and thoughts to her because he's not a member of that unfallen world. So don't viewers bring with us all kinds of baggage such that we could have inappropriate responses to the violence or the misogyny? Like, someone could go and watch the show because they like to see people chopped up or because they like to see women assaulted. So Chris, would you like to come in on that?
Sure, and I think we have to distinguish between the books and the TV show, because there have been some scholars who have demonstrated that the TV show is much more fixated on showing naked female bodies in particular, especially with men in seated positions and women in standing positions, and the men are fully clothed. And there's a lot of male gaze issues in the TV shows that Martin doesn't quite go that far, although it's pretty intimated at a lot of places. But I think you get to the same argument with video games. I'm getting some feedback from somebody else's microphone. That if you play a violent video game and then you go out and commit violence, is that the fault of the video game maker or not? And I think there's some viewer responsibility that's involved with that you can't really put on Martin. Maybe there's an argument either way.
Brian, what do you think?
Well, again, I would also like to reassure anyone that nobody has to watch or read this stuff. And they are perfectly decent human beings for doing it and for not. Every educated person should know something about what people say educated people should know about. But opera, is everybody into opera? No. Baseball, not everybody's into baseball. So we have these choices. And if your soul is being destroyed by it, do avoid it. I encourage you, don't bother. Maybe dip your toe in every now and then, maybe. But if it's soul destroying, find something soul fulfilling. But like the video game argument Chris just brought up is, some people find this as a catharsis. It gets rid of their feelings. It channelizes. I was just watching the movie The Purge, and there's an example where they build it into the structure of society, getting rid of one's hostile feelings. And video games have been shown not to really encourage violence. There certainly are problems when you take the written word and turn it into the visual word. And I'd agree there are problems with some male gaze in Martin and some problems with violence. But as everybody's pointed out, we've always had violence. We've always had nudity. Maybe Ransom was a naturist. Maybe he was used to a culture where he did not objectify the naked human body. I doubt it. I'm not a particular fan of that book, but we all come with our barrel loads of our own personal culture, and that's one of the things that scholars try to do is contextualize that within the larger civilization and within human character. And some people, like one person said, he gave up reading the books because he couldn't find any sympathetic characters. I could see that. I find sympathetic characters, and I appreciate that a lot of characters have very gray moral areas, because most people do. And the truly virtuous are very few, the Briennes and a few others. But Davos Seaworth, Brienne, I think are the few really moral characters. Even Davos is a thief, and Brienne feels like a failure. So what every work of literature does, again, is make us connect in some human ways. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't. And but if it does, sometimes you live with some of these bad choices that directors and actors make. Not everything's perfect, but the overall work, I think, holds together for a lot of people, which is, again, why it's popular and why we're talking about it today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Stephanie sent in a comment quite similar to that. She said, I believe what draws people to these books and series in particular is their ability to personally identify with something, no matter how small. Some emotion, one character, you will find yourself hating a character so deeply that you are wishing a violence or fate upon them, similar to that which you condemn when inflicted upon others. So it's an amazing dissonance. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to respond to that?
That's a really great point, Stephanie, and it's one that I was thinking about when Serena was upping the stakes. And what about the audience? What if the audience is bad, and thinks bad thoughts, right? They're bad fans, and they're not responding to this the way I want them to respond to. And I think one of the really interesting and rich things about the books that in fact the TV shows have not dropped the ball on is the way they educate the bad audience. And I think of this as the sort of surprised by sin element of it, right? You're familiar with Bloom's argument that, that we start off reading Paradise Lost and we sympathize with the devil, and then suddenly we realize, oh no, we have done a terrible thing, right? And that makes us too fallen. Well, there's a lot of parts early on in the books where you want something bad to happen to Theon Greyjoy, and then something really bad happens to Theon Greyjoy, and you catch yourself and you realize you wish this on him, right? And it's like the books. The theologian Leah Perot always quotes Bon Jovi. It's karma or sacrifice. Which do you believe in? Well, Theon gets karma, and we wished that karma on him, and then we are, by the sheer horror of what happens to him, we are educated out of that, right? That's one kind of bad reading, and the books teach us that that's actually a bad reading. Wow. Sansa Stark makes another kind of bad reading, right? She's like, oh, I love the old romantic songs, and therefore the blonde prince is going to make everything right for me, and then really he doesn't. And Sansa starts to move out of that misreading. I think there's what we English geeks call a meta level to what's going on with the books, and where it's picking up on these different kinds of reading and educating us out of them.
Yeah, great. Let me bring in a few more comments from the audience, and then we can get some more responses from you, from the panelists. Robin Yo sent in a comment about the books and the TV show. Chris, I think this was when you were talking. And she says, as Susan once pointed out, the show depicts much more violent acts of sex that is not consensual. And then, yeah, Robin, the example you give is exactly the one that drove me nuts. For example, Daenerys' wedding night with Khal Drogo is much more of an empowering experience in the novels compared to the rape scene that occurs in the television show. Right, so thank you for bringing up that, that difference. Ruth Barrett points out, in most part, the show does show the horror of the battles most of the time that takes away the enjoyment side of the violence. And there are a lot of really strong moments that do question these things. I'm thinking of a moment pretty early on. It's in season 2. It has to do with Gilly, one of the daughters, whose father marries all of his daughters, and they're arguing, John and they're arguing about whether to save her, whether to take her away, and John says, "You can't steal her." And he says in response, "You can't steal her. She's a person, not an object. She's not a goat. You can't steal people." So there's just a straight in your face, like, objectification of people is bad, dear audience, you know, if you're listening and paying attention to that. Tony Mead makes a comment.
No, I don't. What's really interesting the last couple of shows is the debates between Sansa and Jon Stark. And quite often I think they both make good points. And you're wondering where the plot is going to go, who's going to be justified in the end, because they're both making difficult moral choices in a difficult moral world. Right. And the way they're butting heads, I just find utterly fascinating.
Very good. Noam makes a really interesting observation that I was thinking of, Susan, when you were talking about people saying to you, aren't you supposed to be a good Catholic matron? Noam Weiss says, I wonder if people who don't like stories that have a lot of sex and violence are also in favor of banning the Bible. Yeah, I was thinking to myself, is there anything that occurs in these that isn't in the Bible? Yeah, probably not a whole lot. And in some ways, it could be argued that the Bible is even more journalistic in simply saying this is what happened. Especially in the Old Testament, it's really just this is what people do. And you don't get a lot of moral commentary on it. You have to go for the much larger context and the much larger narrative trajectory to get the moral comment on a lot of the behavior.
I mean, one interesting thing that's just come, I recently came across an essay from the late 1980s, demonstrating to very much to the author's satisfaction that the Smurfs promote necromancy. Not because it contains a character who seems to have some sort of necromantic abilities, but because the Smurfs are blue, and dead bodies sometimes go a bit bluish. And this makes it look interesting to be dead, so it promotes suicide and necromancy. Yeah. If we're going to condemn everything because it contains something that someone may find offensive, we're going to run out of culture very quickly. I mean, with regard to charges of misogyny, I do notice it was Cersei rather than Lancel who had to do the walk of shame, and I mean that's interesting. But again, is that misogyny? Is that the objectification of women, or is it a depiction of a misogynistic society?
Right.
And that's a tricky question.
He did cut a star into his forehead.
Well, not when it counts. I mean, that hasn't happened in the books yet.
We're getting into the divergence from the books and the show again.
Which is another whole issue.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, I think part of what we're talking about here is the question of tragedy, right? In a Tolkienian model, we are accustomed to comedy. We're accustomed to a eucatastrophic ending, right? Grief poignant as joy, joy poignant as grief. Which is it going to be? Well, Martin chooses grief. And Tolkien chooses joy, but that's not a joy without cost. I've always taken issue with the critics who I think it's Colin Manlove, who says Frodo's home and dry under the umbrella of authorial fortune. Really? Because that's not how I read that trip to the Grey Havens. In Martin, right, we're blindsided again and again and again. Do you remember your first experience reading the books and the execution of Ned Stark? I mean, it was 3 chapters after that before I realized it had really happened, because I could not believe, with all my, fancy training, that he had actually killed off.
And Tolkien brings Gandalf back from the dead.
That's right. And Martin's responding to that.
But he comes back.
Martin's choosing something different, and it's something that draws our attention to history as tragedy. And here I might be getting too much. I should just hand it over to you, Brian, and you, Joseph, to talk about history and genre, but it does seem to me that Tolkien calls history the long defeat, but his characters are not finally defeated.
Right. Well, Susan, you
Martin
said
leaves that open.
Say a little bit more about this first, and then I'm going to ask Brian and Joseph some related questions, because you've written about this. You've argued that there's an interplay of history and fantasy, comedy and tragedy, discatastrophe and eucatastrophe in Martin's work, right? And
right.
So you're arguing that those things together, they point to a concern with betweenness and brokenness. So tell us more about that, and also about the human and the monster.
Well, I mean, to go back to this idea, to start from this idea of eucatastrophe, right? I mean, for Tolkien, that's a never to be anticipated grace. It's the miraculous. It's victory snatched from the very jaws of defeat, right? But we have become post-Tolkien in fantasy accustomed to that as though it were our right. Give me my happy ending. Come on, I got a lunch date. And Martin makes the possibility of that new again by making the real threat that it won't happen real again, right? Through beheading and destroying main character and hero after hero after hero, right? Chesterton says, children have no trouble believing that there are dragons. What they need is a hero to slay the dragon. Martin makes those dragons real again, but he does so partly by the deep engagement with history, which sees history as, I want to say, fundamentally catastrophic, right? And if not catastrophic in the way the French Revolution was seen as catastrophic, certainly tragic, right? How do we snatch, can victory in the end, can joy in the end be snatched from defeat? This is the other side of Tolkien's vision, right? This is Beowulf. Yeah. This is the monster and the critics, not on fairy stories, is one way of thinking about it for the Tolkien fans. And so with Martin, I want to suggest that we're on neither side of these worlds. We're in this place between. We're always on the wall, right? Looking back to the south, looking up to the north, caught between the living and the dead. His monsters are really interesting, because you have people like the Mountain, and people like Theon, and people like Sandor Clegane, and some of them are terrible becoming good, and some of them are good becoming terrible, and some of them seem to be just kind of caught up in their own suffering or their own evil or their own brokenness. And that the novels ask us to look again and again and again at that space.
Brian, do you want to add on to that? Because your book that you edited is The Game of Thrones versus History. So if it's versus, which one wins?
Well, that's the choice that everybody makes about their own history. And that's one of the things more people who study history have to realize, that history is usually written by the winners. But historians now often look at the losers. And we all sort of shape our history the way we want it to be shaped. Just one example. Wonder Woman movie, the Native American, what's he doing there? He's lost all his people. How did he lose all his people? Wonder Woman asks in her innocence. Well, the white Americans took it away from them. And so American history, seen from the Native American viewpoint, is one unrelenting tragedy, culminating most recently in the North Dakota pipeline. And the stories that have been written about that, and the propaganda spread about that, and the versions spread about that, everybody shapes their own history, who's the good guys and who's the bad guys. One of the great things about Martin's book is the point of view of each of the fictional characters. Historians do that by looking at real historical sources. We're sometimes lucky enough to get contrasting points of view. Martin does it quite consciously as the good guys narrating and the bad guys narrating. As some people are responsible narrators, some who play the game of changing the narration. But we're forced to choose as readers who we like, who we dislike. You know, the speech that Cersei gave in her throne room to try to get her nobles to follow her was an alternate history. She took facts and twisted them and shaped them and presented them in a way that was believable to convince some people to listen to her, whereas Daenerys was presented with a different kind of history in the same episode. So the difference between history and fiction is, well, history actually did happen. But we fictionalize our history all the time. And so that's why and a lot of our sources are fiction. So I, as an historian, am often trying to look at these different points of view that create good guys and bad guys in our narratives, personal, national, whatever. And we pick and choose from these stories and turn it into literature. History is a big story. The word history in German is story. So we're always doing the same thing with history. It's just we're not always quite so obvious or honest about it.
So this is partly a question of what genre we tell our histories in. Mm-hmm. We tell our genres in comedies, tragedies, other genres. Joseph, why don't you come in and talk about genre a little bit too? Could you tell us where Martin sits in the trajectory of modern fantasy? Where does he fit into the abstract shape of the Gothic tradition? And you've argued that maybe he's closer to being the American Pratchett than the American Tolkien.
Well, I think Susan's point about Martin sort of whetting our appetite in a post-Tolkienian environment for a Tolkienian new catastrophe, which may or may not come, is a very good one. My sort of first foray into Martin criticism really was to present him much more as the American Pratchett than the American Tolkien. And this has to do simply with the way that he presents his characters, as opposed to the way Tolkien presents his. One of the abiding myths of Tolkien as a novelist is that he's morally straightforward, that he presents a simple battle of good versus evil. The ring does not turn good people evil. The ring corrupts or emphasizes what's already there. If you want to see exactly how deep Galadriel's goodness goes, look at what she says when Frodo offers her the ring. Tolkien doesn't idealize his characters' souls, he idealizes their bodies. And this is something he borrowed from the medieval literature that he studied as a professor, some things like Beowulf and Volsunga Saga, where all the unglamorous aspects of life are quietly airbrushed out. Okay, and you certainly get this in Middle-earth. The Tolkienian body is a very clean and manageable thing. There are bathrooms in hobbit holes where they celebrate the pleasure, not the necessity, the pleasure of bathing in song. But there are no lavatories, there are no toilets in hobbit holes, because they don't need to be, because hobbits are, of course, aren't people, they're characters, they're words on a page. And if Tolkien doesn't want to put their digestive system, or at least the lower parts of their digestive system, into his story, it doesn't happen. They don't exist from about the stomach down. So the answer to the question, does a hobbit shit in the woods, is no, they don't. Okay, that's just not what Tolkien is interested in. And this is really, I think, one of the most pervasive things that he took from his medieval source material, things like the Volsunga Saga, is what Northrop Frye calls the high mimetic mode, where everything that is not there to promote the greatness and glory of the characters is quietly airbrushed out, which does not prevent a character from behaving badly. Look at the way Achilles treats the corpse of Hector, for example, which is almost exactly the way the Freys treat the body of Robb Stark, for a start. So we have there very much a high mimetic perception of characters in Middle-earth. These people are bigger and more glamorous than we are. Quite ironically, we look up to hobbits. We look up to someone like Meriadoc Brandybuck. By contrast, you have in Martin what a lot of people have called realism, a realistic depiction of his characters, which I don't think really washes because it's just too convenient. If I can be excused for focusing on the books, because that's what I'm studying. The TV series is really sort of a set of illustrations for the book rather than something of its own, any sort of containing any of its own ideas. In the books, when Dany flies away from Meereen on Drogon, she has to try to hike back to Meereen, and she decides to do this. On the first day of the hike, she drinks from a pond. She contracts some terrible stomach bug. By the end of the day, she is squatting in the grass, shitting herself inside out, okay, as a result of this, and vomiting everywhere as well. And it turns out it's really the wrong time of the month to go tramping as well. So you have this pathetic character sort of stumbling through the steppe, splattered with 3 different kinds of bodily fluid at one stage. And there's your Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. There's your Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, your Breaker of Shackles, your Silver Queen. This is not realism. Martin deliberately chooses to have Dany parp herself right then, and to have Tywin's horse, when Tywin rides his warhorse into the throne room after the Battle of Blackwater. In the books, the horse actually drops a load of dung on Joffrey's shoes. You have Khal Drogo stamping around saying this minor cut is just a scar to boast of to my son. The cut turns septic and it turns him into a juddering wreck who's not going to be telling his son anything. These people's bodies repeatedly let them down in a way that is designed to destroy the aristocratic glamour that they clearly feel they are entitled to. This is the exact opposite of the high mimetic mode, which Tolkien so skillfully uses. This is what Fry calls the ironic mode, the presentation of characters who are not as clever, not as glamorous, not as powerful as they think they are. We look down on Tywin in his beautiful parade armor, just as we look up to Meriadoc. So that I think is the fundamental difference between the two, and it's quite a big difference, or it certainly seems like one. I'm just going to quote here from one of Terry Pratchett's novels. This is his novel Mort, where death is first introduced as a major character, and he's striding towards one of the other characters. The air took on a thick, greasy feel, and deep shadows around Mort became edged with blue and purple rainbows. The rider strode towards him, black cloak billowing and feet making little sounds on the cobbles. Those were the only noises. Silence clamped down upon the square like great drifts of cotton wool. The impressive effect was rather spoiled by a patch of ice. Oh, bugger. Okay. Death has slipped on a patch of ice and fallen on his skeletal backside, okay, taking all the power and gravitas he was trying to project with him, okay, because if Pratchett's asking a simple question. If Death really did stalk the streets as a cowled skeleton, he'd be presumably be as vulnerable to slipping and falling as anybody else, okay, and you get this again when Sam Vimes from the City Watch says it must be glamorous to have a baby dragon perched on your shoulder. And Sybil Ramkin responds, yes, it is nice until they crap all down your back. Again, this is what Fry calls the ironic mode, when someone is attempting hymemesis, when someone is attempting to be glamorous and powerful and impressive, and the author then just pulls that rug out from under them, and they fall on their they just collapse. The wonderful stunt that Tywin and Joffrey have clearly stage managed in the throne room there falls to pieces. It just doesn't work. We see that through Sansa's eyes. She's focalizing the chapter and she just giggles at this.
But some of this is not unrealistic. It's actually historical. William the Conqueror stumbled on the beach and fell flat face first into the sand when he landed there, and he was able to recover. The Battle of Agincourt, all the archers were shitting their guts out while they were shooting their arrows. These things, Martin draws on real history, it's just we usually don't include it in the history books. So it's very realistic. I agree, Tolkien is very high mimetic, and one of the things people like about Martin more than Tolkien is he is very earthy, very fluidy, very, very full of this stuff, which history really is too. Martin Luther thought of the Reformation on his toilet. Well, it wasn't a toilet, it was an outhole over it's messy stuff. That's what history is really made of, but we ignore that in history as well. So everything's just cleaned up because Martin wants to throw this more in our faces.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to read a reply that Tony sent in, and I'm going to add a comment too. Tony Mead says, but I think that this physical realism makes the heroism of characters like Dany and Jon and Tyrion even more heroic, in that they do high and heroic deeds in spite of their less than glamorous bodies. So consider that, but also consider, are we not talking about the history of 20th century literature? I mean, Tolkien has often been accused of being out of touch with his times because he was using such a high mimetic mode at a time when high diction was just being seriously questioned, especially in war poetry, right? I mean, John Garth has written about this in his book on Tolkien and the Great War, that you have all the other war poets, all the other World War I trench poets who are saying you can't use this high, lofty medieval diction anymore. So they were starting to put in motion this trajectory that leads us to somebody like Martin, who apparently is not censoring at all, or someone like Pratchett, who's using the high diction only to then undermine it. So what do we think about those points?
Well, I think you're right. It's realistic in terms of depicting things that happen. But again, you've got to remember this is Martin's choosing this. If Martin doesn't want someone do something unglamorous at a time they're trying to be glamorous, they don't. And the obvious example of this actually is the Red Wedding. And I must surely be due a prize for being the first person to talk about the Red Wedding in this panel.
We've been 53 minutes in its first mention.
Oh, I see. Oh, I missed that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, I'm good. Oh, that's good. Right. Well, it's in the mail then. I mean, if you look at the Red Wedding, suddenly all of the low mimes, all of the undercutting of the glamour is suddenly cut, and you are in a very high mimetic situation again. I counted in the books, Catelyn Stark stands on her feet, talking intelligibly and calmly and so on, for 1,315 words, with a crossbow bolt in her back. Okay, she gets hit in the back with a crossbow bolt, and she stands up and takes her hostage and continues to argue with Walder Frey for another 2 pages. Okay, it takes that long. During that time, she thinks to herself, I have lived too long, and Ned is waiting for me. I mean, that is a statement, I think, of very bullish, self-assertive Thanatos that I am going to go out in a dramatic way if I have to go out. Almost exactly the same statement as Leonidas said at the Battle of Thermopylae, "Gentlemen, tonight we dine in Hades," which of course has come through into popular culture as "Men, tonight we dine in hell," because that's the way that they translated it for the movie 300. It's exactly the same statement. When she finally does lose her composure, she does so by tearing her face with her nails. She tears terrible gouges in her face by doing this. That is a ritualized gesture of grief depicted in a number of Greek tragedies, including some by Aeschylus, who is the most famously high mimetic of the Greek tragedians. Catelyn's death in the Red Wedding is a catalogue of high mimetic tropes which are allowed to run their course and achieve their ends without any undercutting. The only person who loses bowel control in that scene is actually Catelyn's hostage. And I mean, you get a similar pattern with Syrio Forel, who fights a heroic last stand. He's a warrior who lives his code. You know,
I think
defending
Susan wants to comment on that point about the Red Wedding. Susan?
Well,
right?
not so much about the Red Wedding in particular, but about this, the idea of a kind of counter-heroic, right? One of the things that I find really interesting about Martin's inversions, which are, as you point out, often very deliberate, right? As part of his response to Tolkien, he's responding to Gandalf's resurrection. He's responding to the White Cloaks and the Black Cloaks by making the Kingsguard kind of bad guys and the Night's Watch kind of good guys. One of the interesting things about the way those inversions operate is the way they also reinvigorate heroism. But I recognize what you're saying, and I agree with you about those scenes, but there are also interesting examples of heroes who appear to be almost entirely low, like Corran Halfhand, right, who address these issues. And the Half Hand is a really kind of striking figure. One of my favorite scenes is his scene with Jon. I mean, your life means no more than your honor as long as the realm is safe, right? And so the glamour may be stripped away, but what survives, and may indeed survive as the only weapon the true heroes of the World of Ice and Fire have against the past that is threatening to consume the present, is a heroism of sacrifice, which is not glamorous, but which is nonetheless real. It's Theon jumping off the walls of Winterfell with Jane Poole.
I think
That's very well said. I'm gonna interject here because we have to wrap up in just a few minutes. So I want to make sure the audience knows that they can send in any final questions, comments, points for discussion. And I think we'll have each of you say something different right now. I think I want to ask each of you panelists if we can kind of start wrapping up with some predictions, make some prophecies. They could be either predictions about something that's going to happen inside the narrative. They could be a prediction about something that's going to happen outside the narrative, i.e. about the writing of the books, the making of the TV shows, or they could be a prediction about reception, about what do we think will happen with these works in the long run, where are they in the future trajectory of literary history. This could come into questions of adaptation too, which I know Susan has worked on, others. So each of you think of some prediction about this world, and audience, send in any final questions, comments, thoughts you might have. I'll read out some of the other comments that you sent in while everybody's thinking. Joseph, when you were talking about the high mimetic mode, Tony Mead observed this mode is true in Star Wars also. And there's probably something that makes it archetypal, right, among other aspects. Tony also was picking up on the comparison between Tolkien and Martin, saying aspects of the moral philosophy of Martin that Tolkien would approve of include its examination of the self-destructive nature of evil and the argument of means and ends, and how when one does evil in the pursuit of good ends, the evil done will destroy any good that was intended or accomplished. Very well observed, Tony. We had just a quick question from Takako. Why are some of the Western fantasies so obsessed with the fear of the winter? Anybody have a quick answer on that? Why are we so obsessed with the fear of the winter?
Because Martin lives in Santa Fe?
Right, okay. Just topographical in nature?
Well, where I live, winter can sometimes be 6 months long. The first year I lived in Saskatchewan, it was 40 below Celsius, but they reached the same at that point. I thought of it as absolute zero for 6 weeks. I thought I'd died and come to some strange and frozen hell. And that was around the time Martin started writing A Game of Thrones. Coincidence?
Hey.
But winter is terrifying, and it's terrifying in a way that reflects probably the great fear of Martin's world, which is that the future will consume itself in barrenness and nothingness, right? These houses that go down to nothing through they kind of consume themselves in their own rage and pride and self-absorption. Well, winter's kind of barren in that way, right? Warm places may be terrifying in their own way, but the starkness, the barrenness of and the lifelessness of the frozen world is one that I think really does reflect a lot of what Martin's doing with his ideas of history and the future.
Robin says winter is typically seen as death, the death of nature, of the harvest and the crops. Tony says winter is a common metaphor for death, especially in Norse mythology, where hell is a cold place. But in contrast, Noam says, of course, you're not from the Mediterranean, where we fear summer, right? And we have those fears as well, crossing the, is it the Red Waste, the desert as well. Brian, were you going to say something about winter?
Well, if you ask for a prophecy, I could say winter is coming and is here and is going to get worse. So that's what's going to happen in the novels and the story. And that's, again, this huge climatic change is the thing that sets up the whole, it sets everything in motion. That winter is coming is the overriding theme in the background. Climate change, as more and more people are pointing out. And how do you cope with that? Because it's, at least for them, it's mostly beyond human control unless they can bring in some magic that is going to change some stuff. And so what's going to happen is a lot more people are going to die, and good people die in bad ways, and bad people die in bad ways. But death isn't omnipresent, and almost all of literature is really, I think people have been talking around, is, you know, how do we deal with death? How do we deal with the reality that we're going to die? And winter is a powerful symbol of death, particularly with the Night Walkers and the White Walkers and all of them.
Well, thank you for saying that, because Stephanie just asked, can anyone comment on the almost underlying yet growing presence of the White Walkers through the books in the show? What is their true significance? Can we guess at least?
I think it's very much a case of. I think this is actually the way in which Martin can be most directly compared to Tolkien. Is that he's using, and of course most other fantasists, he's using the supernatural, this supernatural monstrosity, to emphasize the monstrosity that's going on. I mean the human monstrosity that's going on. The Game of Thrones, this terrifyingly bitter struggle, is essentially rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's, you know, every act that weakens the Seven Kingdoms in the story is weakening their ability to withstand this looming supernatural catastrophe. In that sense, I think the purpose of fantasy is to put human activity in sort of laboratory conditions, to see what it would mean if we could get humanity and put humanity in a beaker and start pouring acids on them to see how they would react. And this is what's happening. And the question of how they will react is a very interesting one. And I could talk about the abstract shape of Jon Snow's career arc probably for an hour. But you've asked for predictions, and I don't really believe in making these sorts of predictions about stories, because we'll find out what the story is soon enough. But I have made two predictions which I think are worth repeating here. First of all, if the solution to all of this is, well, it turns out Ned's special little snowflake is really one of them blondie-haired newt fanciers, so he can assume the Iron Throne because he's really a Targaryen. If that's how this all gets sorted out, I'm going to be faintly disappointed, I have to say. If it's as simple as that. The other point I would just make, which I've been making from the word go, is we are going to meet Ned and Kat's grandchild, and their mother will be Sansa. Sansa becomes a mum before the end of this story. Sansa's career as a chivalric damsel is going like clockwork. She has everything she's ever wanted. She has been divorced from her traditional support networks. She has been shanghaied off to a lonely castle by a mysterious black-clad figure whose intentions towards her are pointedly ambiguous. She is being quested after by the most noble knight in Westeros and her faithful squire. This is all in the book universe, of course. In the TV series, this has already been resolved. But in the books, she is the perfect damsel in distress. Everything is good. She's getting everything she ever wanted. Damsels in distress get rescued. They then they then settle down and have children, probably with their rescuer. So Sansa is going to end up giving birth at some stage in the remainder of the story. Who the father is, how she feels about him, remains to be seen. But it'll happen. I'm quite sure.
Tony sent in a pretty catastrophic prediction here. He predicts that Daenerys will die sacrificing herself and her dragons in the War for the Dawn, bringing a final end to the Targaryens. Possibly.
See, and I would argue that whether that specific version of it, Tony, is true or not, I think the books remain about sacrifice. And it's connected to, I'm not sure I agree with you about Sansa. On Sleepless Nights, I like to amuse myself by imagining Arya and Sansa's reunion, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure. Right? That's going to be a good time. Remember your wolf. Remember when you had a wolf? Remember what happened to your wolf, Sansa, honey. But Sansa is this really interesting figure because, as Joseph rightly notes, she's the captive damsel. She's if the Gothic is all about the imperiled woman in the lonely castle in a domestic space that has become an incarceration, then we have to remember that those women are not always being rescued in A Song of Ice and Fire. Sometimes Ramsay keeps them in a room and they chew their fingers off before they die of starvation. Right? Yeah. One of the things that I want to say, and I don't know if this is as much a prediction as it is a grandiose claim, is that at bottom, the long night has come again. And what we're seeing over and over again in these books is the past returning to haunt the present, right? And at some level, that past has been forgotten. Brian Collishaw points out, right, that the maesters who are in charge of knowing everything actually don't know very much. That the world has forgotten its own past. And we see that at the level of personal histories of characters, and we see that at the level of what I guess we would call climate history or geographical history. We see that at the level of the history of Westeros. Oh, look, the children are gone. Oops, sorry, no, they're not. But we have forgotten. And it's because we have forgotten, because the past has been neglected, that the past is returning and threatening to consume the present.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I'm going to jump in and ask Chris if she has a prediction.
Just this week, Martin came out and said that the next book is now pushed off to 2018, perhaps 2019. But wait, you might get something completely different before I get to Winds of Winter, which is going to be the fictional history of the Dance with Dragons. So you go back to an even older time when you get sort of a Stephen and Maud Civil War situation, and I think his passion is moving on to other things, and I wonder if we're ever even going to get him authoring the end of this, and whether the final authors of this story will be HBO and those writers. That's kind of my prediction, is that once they have their final say, Martin's books, and I know the book lovers are going to hate me for this, but become kind of moot at that point once you have a filmed version. So that's kind of my very offbeat prediction.
All right, thank you. Brian, do you have a prediction?
Well, I think I said before, a lot of people are going to die, and what's interesting, again, is how they die, how they choose to face that inevitable death. The Kobayashi Maru scenario is what we have written large, and I know I want Tyrion to survive, but I can't say that he will. I think when we get towards the end, everybody's vulnerable to ending the story. In the short course, everybody dies ultimately, but some people might wind up with a brief happy end, but I can't predict more than that.
Right. Alex is asking probably kind of the core question that we have probably all been asking from the beginning, is Martin going to follow Tolkien in the Return of the King theme that both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings had? And I'm actually thinking, Alex, too, of the Narnia Chronicles. I was thinking recently about what is this story of each of the Narnia Chronicles to boil it down, and every single one of them is a get the rightful king back story. And I mean, what is this series called? At least the TV show is a Game of Thrones, is who's going to sit in the throne. But this ties into a question that Tim asked. Lord of the Rings has a clear end. Game of Thrones seems like it may never get an ending. And Chris has addressed that a little bit. Well, I want to complicate that a little bit and say, okay, maybe Lord of the Rings has a clear ending, but Tolkien's Legendarium does not. Because it goes on and it dovetails into our history, and then our history picks up and goes on, right? And that brings up questions again of, is our own history eucatastrophic or discatastrophic, right? We could go on, but since we're talking about endings and whether there is any such thing as endings, and we're over time, I think we will wrap it up. But I thank you very much, each of you. It was really great talking with you. I sent out through the chat the links to your various books and publications, so hopefully people will go and check those out. You can find these panelists' websites and other publications and blogs and things pretty easily. So thank you very much to our panelists especially. Thank you to every one of our attendees for being here. And I wish you a good afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Serena.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.